So we haven't sung that hymn before. Took a little while to get into it, I'm sure. Has a little bit of kind of a Christmas carol feel to it, that little lilt. But I particularly like the title and the lyric, Sing My Song Backwards. The idea there is, if you know what's out there in the end, if you know that God's love is going to conquer, it gives you hope here where we are today. Sing my song backwards. It's not unlike what Isaiah is saying in our text today. He is a master of the emotional process. His audience, the nation of Israel, is in exile, having suffered the destruction of Jerusalem, the loss of their homeland, and the humiliation of their God and their nation. Isaiah has an effort here to move his people from despair to hope. And to do that, he first of all expresses their feelings of rage. And secondly, he reminds them of who God is and who they are. And thirdly, he grants them an image of hope. See how he expresses their rage right off the top. Oh, that you, that is God, would come down so that the mountains would quake at your presence, as a fire kindling brushwood causing water to boil, to make your name known to your adversaries, so that the nations might tremble at your presence. Isaiah expresses that kind of waiting in anger for God to provide a silver bullet, or in this case a silver bomb, that might get dropped and make the mountains quake and change their situation, solve the problem, save the day. I imagine most of us have waited for a silver bullet at one time or another. Maybe we were unfairly passed over for a promotion, or let go from a job for no good reason, betrayed by a friend, treated unjustly because of our gender, or because we were a member of the queer community, or we spoke with an accent, or had dark-colored skin. And because there is nothing that you can do about the offender, you sometimes want to call for God's silver bullet. Not unlike Isaiah, we might pray, "Oh God, that you would come down and make this idiot quake in his boots until his teeth rattle and every joint detaches, leave his head hanging and his limbs and digits dangling like a limp marionette." I enjoyed that way too much. Like the ancient Israelites, many of us have felt the anger and despair of suffering beyond our own control, of exile from our primary identities in life. Now, a lesser writer would stop right here at some ancient primal scream therapy and leave the people to wait for the silver bullet and then let their anger grow again into despair. But Isaiah reminds them who God is, for God has acted before. He says, "When you did awesome deeds that we did not expect, you came down. The mountains quaked at your presence." Remember when that happened? It's when the law was given to Moses at the top of the mountain and the people of Israel were gathered at the bottom of the mountain, and God showed up in God's presence, and there was a quaking, and there was fire, and there was smoke, and Moses never saw the face of God, but he saw God walking away. He saw the back of God. And so Isaiah reminds the Israelites of the law that God gave. And Isaiah states the covenant that Israel has with God. God works on behalf of those who wait for God. God helps those who gladly do right. You can kind of see the people, nodding their heads. That's right. But then he turns and says, "But we continued to sin against your ways, and you were angry. How then can we be saved?" And for several verses, Isaiah underlines the fact that Israel has contributed to their own exile. It is critical for them to see that they are party to the situation in which they find themselves. Earlier in the book, he names their wrongdoing. Israel went into exile because the wealthy cheated the poor. I quote to you from chapter 5. Woe to you who are heroes in drinking wine and valiant at mixing drink, who acquit the guilty of a bribe and deprive the poor and innocent of their rights. The God of hosts is exalted by justice. You see what Isaiah has done. He gives voice to their rage because they're in exile. And then he tells them that God is faithful when they walk in God's ways. And then he reminds them that they have not walked in God's ways. And consequently, they are in exile. He does not provide a silver bullet, but he ends this passage with a different image, an image of hope. God is the potter, we are the clay. Usually you think of this is often thought of as a static image. God is the potter. We are the clay, to be totally molded by God, and we don't participate in it at all. But that's not the case. God is not just working with clay. God is making something. God is making a cup or a pitcher or a plate or whatever those things are a gravy boat. That's what they are. And it has a function. It's supposed to do something, not just stand there. And so the hope in here is that God is still creating. And we can still do our function. We could still be what we were called to be. But we have to be reshaped by God's law and by God's call for justice. God will continue to reshape them, Isaiah says, from the inside out. And then they will be led back from exile. America is in exile from itself. America is in exile from itself. Suburbs exiled from cities, wealthy from poor, dark-skinned people from light-skinned people, educated people from uneducated one. And the church does not escape this exile. For some have said that the most segregated time of the week is Sunday morning, when blacks, whites, and Hispanics all go to their own churches. And this tragedy that we saw in Ferguson over the past couple of months is but one symptom of this exile. The evidence of the exile existed long before that. You probably know this, but I'm going to say it anyway. By age 3, children from low-income families, largely African American, know half as many words as children from high-income families. Vocabulary is the basis of all education, so it is almost impossible for most of these children to catch up once they've started preschool. Though African Americans constitute 12% of the population, they make up 40% of the prison population. In Ferguson, 65% of the population is black, yet 1 out of 6 city council members and 3 out of 53 police officers are black. The mayor is white. This is not the only community that harbors these proportions. It is these kinds of disparities that fuel the fear in black communities that the law enforcement system is racist. It is these kinds of disparities that fuels the fear in white communities that black people are violent and unreliable. Now, my purpose in bringing this up is not to make us feel guilty. but to recognize that we have a problem in America, and the problem needs to be solved. And it will not be solved by a silver bullet, and it will not be solved by literal bullets. The problem is the exile that we feel from one another, and the pressure that it puts upon the relationship between the races. I was fortunate enough this Thanksgiving to eat with a retired police officer with 24 years of service. Afterwards, over dessert and coffee, we spoke of Michael Brown, the unarmed young black man who was shot, and Darren Wilson, the officer who killed him. This retired police officer said that, of course, his bias would be on the side of the policeman, but make no mistake, he said, I understand how horribly complex this situation was. He was asked why the officer didn't shoot to disable and not to kill. That isn't protocol, he said. You don't draw your gun unless you feel that you or someone else is in danger of being killed. And if you only wound the threatening person, they may still be able to kill someone else. Plus, it's harder to hit an arm or a leg than it is to hit the larger parts of the body. And he said, make no mistake, in those few seconds, you want to hit the easiest target you can. But, I asked him, by what criteria does the officer make the decision? He said, here's where the struggle is. It all rests on whether or not the officer feels his life or someone else's life is being threatened. It all depends on the feeling of the officer. And here is where the fear and rage of exile shows itself. The feeling of both Darren Wilson and Michael Brown was fueled by the fear and distrust that exists between the races in America. Yes, it was stupid for Michael Brown to disobey a police officer. Yes, it was stupid that Michael Brown's body was left for 4 hours in the streets before it was picked up and given its proper respect. But I would submit that this event and the string of others like it is a symptom of the fear between the races that runs through our cities and suburbs, and not the cause of it. The cause is largely systemic, leveraged through poverty, magnified by the discrepancies in readiness for preschool education, and completed by legal solutions that are trying to solve problems of little education and less opportunity. And the legal system, nor the police enforcement system, is not equipped to solve either of those problems. So what do we do? Well, we do not wait for a silver bullet. We become silver buckshot. Not my phrase, I wish it were. It belongs to Nicholas Kristof. That is, we allow ourselves to be shaped by the ways and laws of God in our lives as we go. The first thing we do is we recognize there's a problem. It's often difficult for us who live in the suburbs to recognize that there really is a problem. But that's the first thing we have to do. And then secondly, understand that God is shaping us in ways to deal with this problem. Some of us might be able to do it in our work. Some of us might gather together and march on the courthouse. Some might work in the legal system. Some might do it in school. Some might do it in your neighborhood. Some might decide that they're going to do some work in Hartford and get to know some folks there across the racial divide. But buckshot is what we have right now. We are not without hope. We are being shaped by God. Ollie Neal is an African-American boy in Arkansas. He was very smart, but he was a troublemaker. He was caught shoplifting. He was a loudmouth at school. Teachers did not like to see him walk into their class. He got so angry with Mrs. Grady, the librarian, at one time that he made her cry because he threatened her. He'd been suspended from school several times. And one day he decides that he is just not going to go to class. He's going to skip it. And he is going to go to the library and just hang out. So he does. And he looks like he's trying to find a book. And he finds one particular book. It's got kind of a racy cover. So he thinks maybe he's going to open it up. And he opens it up and reads through a few pages, notices it's by an author named Frank Yerby, who's African American like him. So it's kind of an adventure tale, and he likes it. And he decides that he's going to check the book out. But just before he gets up to walk to the desk, he thinks, oh no, somebody's going to see me checking this book out, and I'm going to be caught dead checking any book out. I'm a tough guy. That's ridiculous. So he takes the book and he shoves it in his shirt, and he gets up and he walks out. He steals the book, and he goes home and he reads the book, and he liked it. And next week he sneaks back in. He comes back into the library and he sneaks the book back into its place on the shelf. And next to it, there's another book by Frank Yerby that he hadn't noticed the week before. And so he looks around and nobody seems to be looking at him. So he pulls that book out and he shoves it into his shirt and steals the second book. And the third week, he does the same thing. In the fourth week, he does the same thing. He steals 4 Frank Yerby books that he hadn't seen when he was there before. Well, this really got him into reading. And he realized he liked reading. And so he flipped over to some of the classics, some of the titles that he'd heard, and he started reading those. And then he got into journalism. He really liked journalism. And by the time he was a senior, he was a regular reader. And he decided, hey, if going to college is about reading, why not? I like to read. So he goes to college. And as he moves through college, his grades get better and better. And when he graduates from college, he applies for law school. And he becomes a lawyer. Not only does he become a lawyer, he gets appointed a judge in the state of Arkansas. As you can imagine, this African-American kid from this little town in Arkansas is a hero when he comes back to his class reunions. And one year at those class reunions, when he comes back, he sees that his old librarian, Mrs. Grady, is there, still alive at 79 or whatever she was. And so when a time came to stand up and say a few words after the meal, he's one of the people that stands up. And he said, I stand up before you today to make a confession. To make a confession to you, Mrs. Grady. Because when I was in your library, I found a Frank Yerby book, and I stole it, and I read it. And then I came back, and I stole another one, and I read that one too. And then I came back, and I stole another one, and another one. I stole 4 of your books, Mrs. Grady, and I did return them, but I must apologize for stealing them. And he sat down. And then old Mrs. Grady got up. She said, well, thank you for that apology, Ollie. I do appreciate it very much. But I have an apology to make to you. That first book that you stole, I saw you stealing it. And she said, I was going to get you. I mean, you had caused me so much trouble. You had made me cry. You'd caused all the teachers trouble. I just wanted to show you who was in charge. And I was just about to come up and grab you by the collar and drag you into the principal's office. But then for some reason, she said, in a flash of insight, intuition, I stopped. And I thought, what if he really wants to read the book? I'm a librarian. I know who has the book. Why shouldn't I just let him take the book? And so I did. I just let you take the book. But then as I went through the week, I thought, oh my goodness, what if he reads the book? And then he comes back. And we have no other Frank Yerby books here. What am I going to do? So she said that Saturday, I got in my car and I drove 70 miles to Memphis, Tennessee. She said the school did not pay for my gas, but I went. And I went to 2 different bookstores before I found a store that had a Frank Yerby book in it. And I brought that Frank Yerby book back. And I put the proper markings on it. And I set it in its place on the shelf. And then I waited for you. Sure enough, you came in. I saw you sneaking around the stacks, pulling something out of your shirt, putting it on the shelf. I saw you pull that other book off the shelf, shuffle through the pages, put it in your shirt, and walk out of the library. And when that door shut behind you, she said, I turned around and did a dance. I was so happy. I was so happy. He likes the books. And that Saturday, I headed off to Memphis again. And I found a bookstore that had 2 of those books in it. And I brought those books back. And I marked them up the way they should. And I put just one of those books. And you did the same thing the next week. And the week after that, you did the other same thing as well. You read all 4 of those books. I apologize to you, Ollie Neal. I was deceptive. I didn't steal anything, but I deceived you, and I am so glad that I did. Do you see the power you have? Silver bullets, no. Silver buckshot, yes. That is the power that we have. Each of us, we have this power. It's not easy. It's not simply saying, oh, you're a very nice person. No, it is sometimes having to strategize, trying to be able to help people so that they can get around their own embarrassment, as somehow she got around her own fear and her own anger. You see how their situation was pressurized, and yet they were able to step back from it in such a way that this wonderful, beautiful, marvelous thing happens. And can you imagine how many lives of young black men have been different because Ollie Neal was the judge on the other side of the bench? It is true, in Advent we wait. But our waiting is not simply in anger. Our waiting is a waiting of action. Not letting any event or opportunity to go by us that we have to reach across the racial divide. And some will want to organize and be a part of changing the legal system, as God may be calling them to. Or you may be called in other ways to reach across that divide. But I believe that one day America will no longer be in exile from itself. That we will, in fact, be one people. One people. One.